I must confess I've never given a lecture sitting down before. I've been giving lectures for almost 50 years now, and this is the first one I ever did when I wasn't pacing back and forth. So what effect that may have on this, I have no idea. You are familiar with the book that we have just published called Property and Prejudice, the Republican Tradition. And what I seek to do today is to summarize some of the key themes in that book and some of the inspiration for it. In the preface, I claim that that the ideas and institutions, and I'm quoting myself here, of the Republican tradition are the founding DNA of Western society, and this tradition shapes the language in which we think about our institutions and we think about our ideas, and I would suggest often leads to confusion rather than clarity on many of the issues we face. So this book seeks to identify the origins of the Republican tradition. How does it understand society? How is it manifest in public and private life? What are the origins of paternalism? How are women in the working class treated in this ideological tradition? How do democratic and capitalist institutions come to play in this story? And how does liberalism differ at all, if at all, from republicanism? And what does any of this have to do with the Republican Party of the United States? And the answer is, as you'll see, quite a bit, almost everything. But that, to make that case, we need to note a couple of things. One is there's quite a range of uses of the word republic, and it always indicates some kind of claim for independence. So the Iranian Republic, even the Irish Republican Army seeking an independence from Britain, everybody uses the word republic. We had the Soviet Socialist republics in the old days of the Soviet Union. Republic always refers to a kind of independence, even though sometimes it's used to kind of cover up a dependence, as in the case, say, of the Soviet Union and other instances. What it does mean is that you're not a colony, you're not a protectorate. You're essentially an independent or arguably an independent nation making your own decisions. Now, kingdoms can make the same kind of claim, so there's more to republicanism than just the notion of independence. And we need to explore then in Western society the history of this Republican tradition, which in fact really goes back to at least 600 BC, as I will try to make clear. We might note here, and when we start to talk about history, that we as a culture have a very limited knowledge of and interest in history, let alone the history of classical times, let alone the history of classical political economy, the classical economic systems, which are something that I want to focus on here by and by. While even art students may well be in touch with specific histories, an art history course, archaeological history, or a little of architectural history, or a little bit of Plato and Aristotle, but almost never economic history. And the standard educated account runs that there was Greece. We know there were some philosophers and some architects with columns. We know there was Rome, and there was empire, and we've all seen Gladiator on TV a number of times. Then there was the Middle Ages, which at least we've learned to not call the Dark Ages anymore. And then there was something, the Italian Renaissance, or somebody's Renaissance, whatever that was. And then, whoopee, we got to the land of freedom and liberal capitalism emerged. We can be critical of of liberal capitalism, or we can embrace liberal capitalism, but the history runs quite the same. Makes many students and many people feel there's really not much to know before 1500 unless you have really antiquarian tastes. Well, there's actually quite a bit to know, because what we don't know from that earlier period allows us to be confused about what's going on in our own period. The foundational institution of Western society since the 6th century BC is the wealth-acquiring private household, who then, as well as now, operated in a more or less free market, subject to a more or less the law of supply and demand. This is the origins of Republican institutions and ideology, and it really does go back that far. When I undertook this research, I spent quite a bit of time on conceptual clarification, and I read a variety of definitions of capitalism. Very interesting. I feel informed when it occurred, what was capitalism, what wasn't capitalism. That's a very interesting conversation, but I think it rather obfuscates some important issues. One is, again, that society has been organized around wealth-producing private households during the entire period of that history. If capital accumulation, if a relationship between owners and workers is characteristic of capitalism, if seeking markets, again, things being governed by the law of supply and demand are characteristics of capitalism, well, in that sense, which I'm simply going to call private sector institutions are the foundation. Profit-seeking private institutions are the foundation of Western civilization. We need to look at this in more detail. First, to understand it, and secondly, to defend my claim here. Why is Aristotle's account of this so important? Well, in Aristotle's Politics, he begins saying that these private sector households are the foundation of political organization. They get together to promote their property and their system of property accumulation. At least for the classical Athenians, they also got together for mutual edification, cultural events, etc., etc., and that was all very important to Aristotle, but nonetheless, it was Athens, every city in Greece was organized around private sector households. Aristotle's account is really important. Aristotle is first and foremost a classifier of things. And he wants to look at all of the different cities around him in the Greek world that his students have gone out and gotten their constitutions, etc. And he wants to essentially do a descriptive and empirical count of what is going on in those cities. How are they organized? What is the relationship between the polis, their city-states, to these wealth-seeking households? So Aristotle's description is an excellent description for us of what's actually going on. It also works as a prescription, as a way of life that follows, and we'll look at this in more detail. It's a wildly influential opinion because essentially it establishes in a Greek way the natural right of private property and the right of private property to dominate the political sphere. This predates Locke, who makes exactly the same argument 2,000 years later, roughly, if I've done my math here in my head right. And he makes the same arguments, albeit in Protestant language. I often have said that Locke is really Aristotle for modern Protestants. Let's go further into that. The household, the oikos, and oikos in Greek, and the domus in Rome, which will follow Greece. And by the way, if you have oikos yogurt, you are simply talking about homemade, home-style yogurt. And oikos is also where we get our word economics, essentially referring to economic activity between households. The household is first and foremost wealth-producing. The first thing Aristotle wants to tell us is these households are there to increase their property, and the members of the house, their wives, their children, their free labor that they might employ, their slave labor, which they probably own, are there to advance the material interests of the household. It's not nomicile. We're not talking about the local household. This isn't mom and dad and the kids. If you go to work for somebody else, you do not, in the Greek sense, you're not part of a household. That's just where you happen to sleep. So if you go out the door to work for somebody else, you're not a householder. If you, on the other hand, own your shipping company, your rock quarry, or agricultural estate, any number of things, then you, both large and small, are going to be considered households. But again, if you make a living working for somebody else, you're not a householder. My example, I've taught at university my whole life. I did not own the university. It was not my university to teach in. I needed to get permission to work from the university in order to be employed. I'm not complaining. They paid me well enough. So, in this case, the Republican household, then, is dominated by, well, the word in Greek, in Latin is paterfamilias, the head of the household. In Greek, it's going to be pater, from which actually little children say papa for generations even today's. Even the Pope is called Papa by Italians because he's the head of the church. So it's very clear in Aristotle, who makes it very clear that people who don't own their own property, women, workers, slaves, are all, to some significant degree, intellectually inferior to their superiors, who are the owners of property. And in fact, the owners of property, where we get paternalism, the owners of property are in a position to provide jobs and protection for these people. They are clearly his subordinates. He is clearly their superior. He complains bitterly about passages in Plato where Plato doesn't seem to want to make this distinction, and Aristotle keeps insisting that Plato gets it wrong. Frankly, I think Plato gets it right. But in any event, so these are households. They could be small. They could be as small as the corner store that looks to simply provide some, in those times, some wheat, some rice, some olive oil, etc., some grain on the corner, to being giant estates where a household might have, there's one widow in Rome who was supposed to have had 120 different estates within her economic household. So we're looking at what might be considered really giant corporate entities of sorts, but controlled by household heads. The Republican polis for Aristotle and John Locke is an association of household heads to promote and protect their property. And those property owners are the ones who get to be the citizens. This is very important. It's the natural order of things. If the purposes of government are to protect and promote private property, those without private property are not citizens. They at best have an indirect interest in the progress of private property. So they're not considered ones who can vote. We will touch later on how recent it's actually been, if you look at it in historical perspective, that the vote was expanded even to small householders, say, in the United States or Great Britain. But we'll touch on this by and by. The society established by the Greeks, which we came to know culturally and politically as Hellenism, totally became part of what Rome was. Rome saw it as civilization itself, the Greek order of things. They took it often at the point of a spear to people who wanted it, or whether people wanted it or not, to expand their empire. But that notion that private sector commerce required a state to provide some law and order and infrastructure was built into that whole Republican tradition. Modern Republicans argue to this day that this is all the state should provide now. That education or health care or whatever it may be are not really the role of the state, and those too belong in the private sector. So we get essentially this model, and I stress this as well, that this is this Hellenistic view, private sector economy, private sector households, living in a more or less free market, subject more or less to the laws of supply and demand, and that's certainly the best we can say about modern capitalism. Rome will fall, and this is what throws some people off this transition. No time today to go into all of the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, but an essential one is very important economically and reinforces what I've been saying. The problem with empires is the more they expand, the more borders they've got. The more borders they've got, the more borders they've got to defend, the more property they've got to protect. And it becomes more and more and more expensive and a tax burden. Wealthy families encourage the expansion of the empire because it's in their economic interest. It is, after all, where Rome got cheap slaves. But on the other hand, let me put it that they really encouraged this infrastructure. Rome was famous for its roads, its ports, its law, etc. So this is very weird. You can keep this in, please. This talking to nobody's crap. I can't see any of your faces. I don't know when you're getting it, when I'm making sense, when I've said something stupid, and when I've confused myself. I'm simply shooting in the dark. Anyway, okay, now back to the modern world. See, at this point I would normally say, am I making any sense out there? And you'd look a little confused, and then I'd say, what are you confused about? And then you'd ask a good question that all the other students would think was a good question, and we get to go over it again, and I'd know how the hell I was doing up here. Anyway, back to the modern world. When Rome falls and creates what we call the Middle Ages, roughly from 500, speaking roughly, to, 13, 14, 1500, depending on where you are, and even later in other places, for instance, Quebec, the isolated household, in the absence of Roman law and order, its roads, its ports, its protection from pirates and bandits, one could go on and on and on here, is now stuck on its own. There is no, if you like, state or empire apparatus within which the households operate. So if they want to defend them, it's up to them. If they are cut off from commerce, now they're no longer engaging in an active and expanding Roman economy. Now they're unable to trade. Citizens on the Rhone River in France can no longer send their wine to Rome. As the economic historian Hilbrenner once said, life shrinks to its smallest economic compass. Free men and women essentially assign themselves to these households where they will have some protection and some mechanism to have food and shelter and dispute settlement on a very local level. Your paterfamilias becomes, as it were, the lord of the manor or the head in the castle. He will have to have some armed men trained to help others, members of the citizenry, be able to fight to defend themselves. And everybody will build a castle on a hill and retreat to it whenever somebody comes up the river that looks like it's a threat. And believe me, between Phoenician pirates from the south, Vikings from the north, Magyar hordes from the east, there are a lot of things in that period, particularly in the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, to defend yourself from. So that gets the Middle Ages that some of us know a little bit. Isolated households in the absence of any collective way to protect themselves are on their own. Skipping over many, many details, some of which are not skipped over in the book, the Crusades from just before 1100 to just before 1300 provide economic stimulus. That economic stimulus is exploited first and foremost in the West by Italian city-states, and we saw the revival of commerce, and we saw the revival of the Renaissance of classical scholarship, Aristotle and the Roman Cicero, chief among them. So that notion of that recovery of the greatness of Rome, of the greatness of Hellenism, is now reappropriated into the Republican political theory of the Italian Renaissance. And that spreads north very, very quickly, not least of all to the Low Countries and to Holland, which we'll talk a little bit about. Holland is very, very interesting because it actually was a republic, an absolute republic of property-owning men that decided it would be cool to have a king anyway. And so in very modern history, they essentially chose to have a king, and now they're the kingdom of Holland, even though they function, or maybe they're the kingdom of the Netherlands. Anyway, they function very much in a modern republican fashion. So we get the slow but sure return of kind of republican order, what later we might call bourgeois order. And we get the kind of model for corporate capitalism. In the US, for instance, the Republican Party stacked the Supreme Court, and that court ruled that corporations are corporate persons to allow, under the freedom of speech and expression, to spend as they will to influence elections. And of course, that's been very much of the Republican efforts in the United States to spend money in the primaries to elect candidates to the state legislatures, who will then gerrymander their federal electoral boundaries, which is part of the way they look to elect presidents who don't get a majority of the vote. What you should be asking in this very brief overview is, did the extension of the franchise, that is, the extension of being able to vote, change all of this? Well, some places it changed some of it. Let me read, because I don't have all of this information in my head. Let me just give you some examples. In the United States, even small property holders were struggling to get the vote in the first half of the 19th century. It was interesting that I studied in the United States for the first 4 years of my life. I was an American citizen, and nobody ever told me that it wasn't universal suffrage, at least for men at the time of the Constitution, that it was really reserved for essentially property owners, and not any property owners, not mom and dad trying to get through in their mud hut, not Little House on the Prairie, but real property owners, you know, the serious players, as they like to think of themselves. So, universal male suffrage for men over 25 did not appear in the United States until 1925. Okay. In Great Britain and the United States, the 1830s saw the franchise expanded to small owners and those renting significant land, if it was agriculture or productive property. Still in Great Britain, only 1 in 7 males were allowed to vote, and no women, no matter how much property they owned. In Canada, following Great Britain, the vote was extended the first time in 1918 to all men over 21, and in 1920 women's suffrage follows. It might be nice if once in a while it was noted when we're talking about how women didn't get the vote until 1920, then in fact men didn't get the vote until 1918. Because this goes back to the Republican tradition. Nobody counts but the property-owning male owner of the productive property. The women, children, free labor, slave labor were answerable to the paterfamilias, and he, by his position, was the only political actor. He would then agree to submit himself to laws that he and his peers, other property owners, had come to through some legislative process. But the interests of the other 80+ percentage of the population were not represented in any immediate way. Let me give you a really local example here in British Columbia. When I moved here to teach at the University of the Fraser Valley, I discovered that renters weren't allowed to vote in municipal elections, or school board elections, or parks board elections. And it took the moderately New Democratic government of 1972 to allow citizens of the community to vote in those elections. The reason that was given was right by the local burghers, was right out of luck. They don't own property, so they don't pay taxes, and therefore they don't pay for the government, and therefore they should have no say in it. I remember asking at a municipal meeting in Chilliwack where this was brought up, and I was renting at the time, as I was for many years, I said, if renters don't pay taxes, how come every time my landlord raises my rent, he tells me? Then it's because his taxes went up. And I was called from the stage a communist for having raised that particular point. So in that sense, that notion that voting, yes, you bet it was restricted for women, even 2 years longer than men. But the fact of the matter is, anybody who wasn't the paterfamilias wasn't getting to vote into the last 100 years or so, even in what we call liberal democratic countries. And that's why. So We might also note, which we could do in great detail, I already wish that I'd written the book, finished the book a few months after the most recent events rather than a number of months ago, because now we have American politicians, Republican politicians saying, well, this isn't a democracy, it's a republic. Really asserting that notion that, well, this is really something upper class families should run. The North American, so anyway, think of all the voter repression in the United States that's going on at this time, trying to keep who from voting? Well, the poor, the students, people of color. Because they don't primarily vote for the Republican Party, and keeping those people, making it as difficult as you possibly can for those people to vote is a crucial part of their strategy. I know this sounds a little heavy-handed and a little bit of a contemporary comment, but what's going on in the United States right now is what's going on. And pulling punches about it really misses the point. One of my favorite lines in Plato is, the least we can do as honest men is call things by their right names. And I think we ought to be calling attempts at fascism by their right names. What do I mean by fascism? Authoritative, not democratic capitalism, but authoritarian capitalism. I also want to note, which I touch on at the end of the book, is that North American liberals in both Canada and the United States stand up against almost every form of prejudice except prejudice against the working class. That prejudice that's been there since Aristotle said we're doing them a favor because they really can't think, so we'll do the mental labor and they'll do the manual labor. We'll give the orders, they'll do the work. Not just minorities of color face structural inequalities, but all working people, especially when ununionized, face structural inequalities. And women and people of color are those workers. They are poor. They don't have medical care. They're more subject to be affected by the virus, for instance. And that's as true as poor white workers as it is people of color and women. But in North American ideology, we can't talk about economic class, about the distinction between those who own the households upon which the rest of us work and those of us who don't. And in fact, we often mask that in our conversations with discussions of gender or race. My notion here is that there are not specific issues for gender or racial minorities, but their general oppression comes from the form that they're on the poorer edges of the working class. They're the cleaners, they're the bank clerks, they're the waitresses, etc., etc., etc. So, in many ways, talking about the fact that COVID affects blacks in the United States, which it does, more than it does, well, who? Well, actually, it affects all workers who are poor, work in those conditions, have those levels of anxiety, those levels of nutrition, etc., etc., etc. In Europe, we've had a different orientation in the post-war period for a number of reasons, some of which I touch on in the book. For government to see its role is trying to mitigate the most obvious contradictions in capitalism and the kind of inevitable inequality that they are not just prone but virtually destined to create. trying to find some kind of balance between the general good and the general condition of the overall well-being of people, while still trying to embrace those things which capitalism does well. That comes in many different forms and is a whole discussion unto itself. But Anglophone capitalism in England and the United States has traditionally taken a very, very different path for a number of reasons, which I discuss in the book. And one of the aspects of that is that the reality of economic class and the implications of that. If you raise the issue of economic class, the Republicans and others and liberals accuse you of trying to foment class war. Well, in that sense, the class war has been going on for a long time, and working people lose. So, in that sense, these kind of values of republicanism, the subordination of the working class, that they are second-class citizens, and they may begrudgingly obtain some voting rights over time, is the same system that we've had since, as I'm suggesting, 600 BC. That core runs through completely and is only, and that core of the household as the key institution is only broken by the collapse of the Roman Empire, in which for a period of about, well, depending where and when, from 700 to 1,000, more or less, depending on where we're talking about, there is going to be this place where there is not any overarching order and all the households are on their own, and people, freemen, found it in their interest to essentially contract themselves as serfs, as viands, as various kinds of categories in the medieval structure of things in order to have access to the economic and military security that only a household could provide because there was no overarching state to provide it. How long did that go?